We're going to start the urinary system looking at the functions of the kidneys and the anatomy. The kidneys have a lot of functions, but the main one is to filter the blood and make urine. And the urine is going to contain the waste products that we no longer need. So for example, urea, that's a waste product from breaking down proteins. So remember when the amino acid is broken apart and we take that amino group off, that goes to the liver, made into urea, and then the kidneys will excrete that. Creatinine, that one comes from creatine phosphate, which remember that's used to make ATP in skeletal muscle. And uric acid is produced when RNA is broken down. Many of the medications that we take also are excreted in the urine, and food additives and pesticides that you may have ingested with your food, those are also excreted by the kidneys. The kidneys are really important to also regulate plasma ion concentrations. So there's a lot of different ions that we need to keep in the normal range. And if they get out of whack, some things can happen, especially with nerve and muscle function. The kidneys will also regulate plasma osmolarity, which is the solute concentration. And that's really important for the movement of water by osmosis. So you want to keep that in the normal range, because if it's too high or too low, that can affect the water levels in the cells. The kidneys also regulate the plasma volume. So they can either save extra water from the urine to increase the blood volume, and that would increase blood pressure, or they can urinate out more water, and that would decrease the blood volume and decrease blood pressure. The kidneys also help regulate the blood pH by either saving or secreting bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And remember, the other system that regulates blood pH is the respiratory system. The kidneys also have an endocrine function. They also secrete several hormones. They do secrete erythropoietin, which remember that's going to go to the red bone marrow and tell it to make more red blood cells. The kidneys also secrete renin, which we're going to talk about later, but that ends up setting off a bunch of different steps that will increase the blood pressure. And then the kidneys will also activate vitamin D3 to the active form calcitriol. And remember that vitamin D3 will tell the intestines to absorb more calcium from your food and increase blood calcium levels. The kidneys do a little bit of gluconeogenesis, but most of it's going to be done by the liver. Remember, gluconeogenesis is when you make new glucose from things that are not carbohydrates. Let's take a look at the anatomy of the urinary system. It's pretty straightforward. We've got the two kidneys, and their blood supply is from the renal artery and renal vein. And then we've got the ureters, which are going to take the urine made by the kidneys down to the bladder where it will be temporarily stored. And then when you urinate, the urine will go out the urethra to the outside. So here's just a summary of the anatomy of the urinary system. We have our two kidneys, which their job is to filter the blood and make the urine. And we're going to look at their parts in just a minute. We have two ureters that are going to take the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The bladder is going to temporarily store the urine. And then the urethra will take the urine from the bladder to the outside. And then the blood supply, we have the renal arteries and veins. And the kidneys have a very large blood supply. They will get 20% of the cardiac output at rest. And that's because the kidneys' main job is to filter the blood and get rid of the waste products. So it does get a lot of the blood from that. And then also the kidneys are very active. They need to make a lot of ATP because they do a lot of active transport, as we'll see later. So they need a large blood supply to keep bringing in glucose and oxygen so they can keep making ATP. With the anatomy of the kidneys, we have this outer part called the renal cortex. Remember, cortex means outer. And then in the middle here, we have the renal medulla. And then we have the renal pelvis, which is going to collect the urine that's made by the kidneys, and then the urine will then go down to the ureters and out to the bladder. If we take a closer look in the renal cortex and the renal medulla, you can see that there are millions of these nephrons. So the nephrons are the functional units of the kidneys. So they're actually going to be filtering the blood and making the urine. Each kidney has about 1.3 million nephrons, so we've got a lot of them.